So last lesson, you listened to a podcast about ideologies and thinking about this idea of what is an ideology. So according to Hayward, an ideology is a more or less coherent set of ideas that provides the basis for organised political action, whether this be intended to preserve, modify, or overthrow the existing system of power. And this idea of more or less coherent is quite crucial because you as we go through the different ideologies, you'll see that there's actually a lot of differences between a single ideology. So one nation conservatism is extremely different to neoconservatism, for example. Modern and classical liberalism are very different too, as is third way socialism and revolutionary socialism. So it's more or less coherent because they might have the same sort of foundation of ideas but may differ on different elements of that. So this is a map of the different components of an ideology. And this is how we can try and make sense of ideologies. So the first thing is, what is that ideology's view of existing order? Is it to preserve it? Do they want to modify it? Do they want to overthrow it? So what is it that they think about the current system that they are in? So right now, the existing order is liberalism or liberal democracy. So what is a liberal view of that right now? It would be quite positive. What was the liberal view of the existing order before liberalism was the dominant view? Then the other thing is the vision of the future society. So if they want to preserve the existing order, the vision of the future society would be about maintaining the existing order. If they feel that there is inequality in the existing order, the vision of a future society would be a more equal version of that society. And how are they going to achieve that vision? So that is the third component, the theory of political change. Is it going to be a peaceful search for freedom? Is it going to be a more aggressive search for freedom through revolution, for example? So it's about how do they each view these elements and components of an ideology. So the first thing we're going to look at then is the view of existing order. What was the existing order before liberalism? And what was their view of that existing order? But first, I want us to think about this term liberalism. What does it actually mean? So when you think of this term liberal, what is it that comes to mind? And in America, not so much in Britain, but in America, it's quite a slur, it's quite an insult. You're a liberal is often thrown around in reference to people like Democrats and so forth. So you can see in the satirical image on the left here, it's things like hating America, believing in equal marriage, having no nerve endings, helping bears, reading the New York Times, and so forth. So quite a negative perception of it. But essentially, all of these things are synonymous with being more left-leaning. Not completely left-leaning, but more left-leaning in ideas. And you can see here on this British political cartoon on the right, which is quite an old one from the early 20th century, Toryism, so the Conservative Party today, is the old way, where capital, so wealth, is concentrated and owned by the rich, and they do very little labour. Whereas the socialists believe that they do all the labour, so they should get more of the capital. And then liberalism is saying, let's just find a balance. Let's find a balance between capital and labour and just find a middle ground. So that's kind of how liberalism has perceived itself, as this middle ground to radical politics. And as you can see from this gravestone, give me liberty or give me death, Thomas Paine, rip liberalism. So beginning in 1776, which is the American Revolution, and dying in 2016, which was the election of Donald Trump. So arguing that Trump is the end of liberalism and that has been replaced with a more populist, nationalistic ideology. Not completely true, but an interesting argument nonetheless. So what was life before liberalism then? So liberalism is a dominant ideology today, even if the gravestone disagrees, but it still is the dominant ideology. What was the dominant ideology before liberalism took the reins of power? So it was the medieval era, the Middle Ages. So as you can see here in the medieval era, you have quite a rigid hierarchy, quite a rigid structure, and this was the way that society was structured in a rough sense. So you had the king on top, who was appointed by God. Underneath the king, you had nobles, who the king shared power with, so gave them some land in exchange for their support. Then underneath that, you had the knights, who reinforced the power of the nobles and the king. And then beneath them, you had peasants, who were sometimes called serfs as well. So a serf was an agricultural labourer bound by the feudal system who was tied to working on the lord's estate. So essentially, these serfs were servants. They couldn't actually leave the estate without the lord's permission. They couldn't get married without the lord's permission as well. So they would work the land, and so in exchange for working on the land, they would give a portion of the food that they had produced to the lord of the manor, and then the lord of the manor would allow them to stay there and grow crops and so forth. It's a very rigid hierarchy though, because if you're born a peasant, you'll die a peasant, your children will be peasants and so forth. If you're born a noble, you'll stay a noble, and you can only be a king for inheritance in the same way. So there is a clip on the drive as well that you can watch, which talks a little bit about medieval life in a bit more detail to understand this a little bit more. So essentially, this is, as you can probably agree, quite an unfair system. The idea that if you're born wealthy, you'll stay wealthy. If you're born poor, you'll stay poor. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels actually analyse this in the Communist Manifesto. So the Communist Manifesto is a book which is about advocating socialism around the world. But it's also quite an interesting history of the political ages before the 19th century. And essentially in the book, in the manifesto, it's only a short pamphlet, they argue that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. So in society there is constantly one group who are oppressed and another group who are the oppressors. So any event in history is about these two groups fighting with each other. And this is also explored in E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. And he very heavily looks at history through this lens of the Communist Manifesto, this lens of class struggle. He says this: class happens when some men, as a result of common experiences, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of their interests as between themselves and as against other men whose interests are different from and usually opposed to theirs. The class experience is largely determined by the productive relations into which men are born or enter involuntarily. So essentially, with this, you have this class of people, the peasants, and they are all involuntarily born into this position, and they start to form an identity because of that. One day, they start to realise our life is harder than the nobles. That's not because we work less than them, in fact we work harder than them, but because we're peasants, we're always going to stay peasants. We are dissatisfied with this, we do not like this, and then that identity is formed. When that identity is formed, you have consciousness. When you have consciousness, you can shape your dissatisfaction towards a vision of a future society. Then once you've done that, you can start thinking about how you're going to achieve this, your theory of political change. So this happens then with liberalism. You have people being dissatisfied with the fact that they're born poor and want to change that. So the other thing too, which is a problem for liberalism in the Middle Ages, is the fact that the king has unquestionable power. And the king has unquestionable power, as you can see in this image. If you look here, this is a picture of King James, and you can see there are angels putting a crown on his head. He's being lifted up into heaven. So this was drawn by his son after his dad died. And he wanted to do this to symbolise this idea of the king is being brought up to heaven. The only two people who that happened to, the ascension, only happened to Jesus and Mary. So kind of making that link that the kings are godly. They are God's representatives on earth. therefore you cannot question them, which is again problematic, because if you can't question power, then you're vulnerable to that person with power. So you're not safe, you have no freedom in that respect. So this is called the divine right of kings, a belief that kings were chosen by God and thus infallible. So they cannot do anything wrong, you have no right to question them. So the only body higher than a king in the Middle Ages then was the Pope. And you can see this here, where King John is surrendering his crown to the Pope. If anybody did Migration, Empire and People for GCSE history, you'd understand that essentially King John had managed to cause problems with the Pope, and as a result, because he tried to challenge his authority, the king realised that he was less powerful than the Pope and had to essentially bow down to him and ask for his forgiveness. So the only person higher than the Pope, higher than the king, was the Pope, because the Pope was God on earth, essentially. So again, these people haven't necessarily earned their power, they've inherited it, less so with the Pope, and they have unquestionable control over the lives of individuals, which is seen as quite dangerous and detrimental to freedom and individual liberty. So, how was this system challenged then? So you had things like the Reformation, which laid a challenge to it in the sense that it was a Protestant movement arguing that communication with God shouldn't rely on priests. So you had where essentially there was a movement which was about trying to reduce the power of the Catholic Church, trying to essentially take it away from the church, taking it away from kings and bringing it down to normal people, allowing more normal people to be able to worship God in their own way, rather than following whatever the church was saying. You also had the printing press, which was so crucial, because the printing press meant that rather than just publishing something and having a monk sitting and copying it out for weeks, you would be able to actually mass produce texts, which means that you could share ideas much more widely. So this is crucial for challenging the feudal system, because when you're criticising and offering alternative narratives to the status quo, people would be able to read it. And this was also exacerbated by increased literacy as well, because these texts became more affordable because more of them were produced. So the feudal system begins to be challenged because it's no longer almost peasants sitting in church with open beaks listening to whatever the priest told them the Bible said, and it actually led to people questioning and thinking independently for themselves. You also had the rise of capitalism as well. So if we're thinking about Elizabethan England, you start to see challenges in the feudal system there. So what happened was Elizabeth was concerned about the power of the nobles. She felt that they were a threat to her power. So in order to strengthen her reign, she actually marginalised the nobles. She tried to take away as much of their power as possible. The only way that she was able to do this is by elevating a new class of people, the gentry. So what she did is she gave some people who higher born peasants the opportunity to climb, and she essentially gave them things like contracts to go and do exploration of the world, open up their own shops and so forth. And what happened then was this new class of people began to rise, and this was the beginning of more social mobility as well. So this gentry are kind of that liberal class, the idea that where you're born is not where you're likely to end up, and your social status is not fixed. And it's about challenging this idea of the accident of birth then. So liberalism then, so liber is Latin for a class of free men who are neither serfs nor slaves. So it's about freedom. It's about criticising this accident of birth, and it's about being able to grow and to be able to go up that social hierarchy if you work hard enough. So they were able to articulate their identity, and as they were able to articulate that identity, they were able to kind of climb through the ranks, criticise the existing system, and form their own future society. So this was mentioned in the Communist Manifesto, where Karl Marx says, "Free men and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And essentially, it was the oppressed that won this fight. It was the liberals that won this fight because they were able to climb that social hierarchy and overthrow the accident of birth. So the liberal then, the view of existing order was that there was no social mobility. Society was irrational. It was a society actually where if you criticised the Catholic Church, you could have been murdered for that. You could have been burnt at the stake for being a heathen, for questioning God. And there was no individual freedom as well. You had no choice. You were at the behest of your Lord, who was your master.